Good morning. Today we look at chapters 43 through 45 in the book of Genesis. And it's the continuing story of the famine that is basically worldwide as far as the world goes in Egypt and Israel and that part of the world. And chapter 43 begins with, now the famine was severe in the land, and when they had eaten up the grain, their father then said to them, so they've used up everything that the brothers had gotten from Joseph on the first trip. And and Jacob says to them, go again and buy us some more food. But Judah speaks to his father and says, there's no point of us going unless we can take our brother Benjamin with us. This man was adamant about that, The man solemnly warned us, saying, you will not see my face unless your brother is with you. And then they go through and, Israel, Judah, Jacob, Israel, the same person, of course, his new name. Why did you treat me so badly to tell the man you had another brother? I mean, why would they withhold that information? But I mean, Israel, the dad is just, he's beside himself and he's trying, how could this happen to me? There's just so many things have gone on. And, they respond. The man questioned us carefully. And he asked, is your father alive? Have you another brother? And Joseph knew the questions to ask because, he's a brother. So he knew what to ask. And then Judah says to his father, send the boy with us. Let us be on our way. I myself will be surety for him. You can hold me accountable for him. You can hold me accountable. And so many people in today's world don't want to be held accountable for anything, or they'll say, oh, it doesn't mean anything. Or it isn't going to hurt anybody. But accountability is something that, a lot of people just don't hold much to that these days. If something happens, something breaks, well, it's not my fault, But, if you were doing something wrong, if you did something improperly, if you used the tool the wrong way, there is accountability. And accountability is something that, employers like to see in employees. They like to be on time, do what you're supposed to do, learn your job, accountability. So Judah says, let me be accountable. You can hold me accountable. He makes a promise to his father. And that's what accountability is. And then he says, if we don't bring him back, let me bear the blame. If we had not been delayed, we could have been there back twice now. So they go. And their father says, if it must be, go. But do this, take double the money with you. Carry back the money that was returned. Maybe it was an oversight. Take your brother with you, and may God Almighty grant you mercy. May God be with you, that you may bring my son Benjamin back. So they set off. And verse 16, when Joseph saw Benjamin with him, he said, bring the men to my house, slaughter an animal, make ready. I plan to have a meal with them. I'm going to serve them. So they did all of this, and Joseph's brothers, quite understandably, were wary. They were a little bit, wondering what's going on now that this great man is inviting us to his house for a meal. When, he questioned us so much. They wondered about his motives. What's going to happen to us now, And then they bring in the food and they make ready for Joseph to come. And then he asks them about his father again. They assure him your father is alive. And he looks at Benjamin. Is this your youngest brother? Yeah. And they go through all of that. And then, he was so overcome, he says, with emotion upon seeing his brother, Benjamin, that he had to excuse himself and go to another room. And, I can understand that. When you see somebody you haven't seen for a long time, or if suddenly someone that, you haven't had contact with for a long time, contacts you with, it's easy to become overcome, easy to be overcome that way. So he wept in his private room. He washed his face and composed himself and came back out. And then, listen to this, they served him by himself and them, the brothers, by themselves, because the Egyptians could not eat with Hebrews, for that was an abomination to the Egyptians, to eat with such a lower class people as these Hebrews. And yet they kept Joseph, a Hebrew, separate from the other Hebrews. And most likely because of, the position that Joseph had. So they ate. And it says, verse 33, when they were seated, the firstborn according to his birthright and the youngest according to his youth, the men looked at each other in amazement. So they had placemats, they had them seated, by age, by eldest to the youngest. And how would they know to do that? It was, another thing that didn't make sense. And then he fills their sacks and they take off. They're getting ready to take off on their way. And he says, fill the men's sacks with food as much as they can carry, and then put each man's money back in the sack, and put my cup, the silver cup, in the top of the sack of the youngest, along with the money for the grain. Joseph is setting them up, returning their money again, putting intentionally putting his silver cup, his special cup, in the sack of Benjamin. And as they leave, they are followed. And they are overtaken by Joseph's men. And they go through the sacks of all of the food and everything, and they find Joseph's cup in Benjamin's sack. And they are devastated. Why wouldn't they be devastated? Here the money is in the bags again, what's going on here? And then Joseph's cup is in Benjamin's sack. How could he have done that? It's just, but it's there. And Joseph is rightly, they think, upset by that. So they return to the city. Verse 13, they returned to the cities. In 14, Judah and his brothers come to Joseph's house while he was still there. They fell to the ground before him, to worship. What is this you have done? He asks them. And then he says, they offer themselves, wondering how we can clear ourselves. And Joseph says, only the one in whose possession the cup was found shall be my slave. But as for you, go to my father. So he's saying, I'm going to keep Benjamin here. He's going to be my slave, and you others can return home. And of course, that, think about Judah's promise to his father to be accountable. You may hold me accountable for him. So Judah steps up and speaks, "O my Lord, let your servant speak a word. If we don't bring Benjamin home to my father, he will certainly die of a broken heart," is basically his plea. He comes on, they do what their father told them. And he said, he alone is left of his mother's children. This Benjamin is so important to my father that, we can't leave him here. But we brought him because you were adamant. And we told our father that we had to have our son, Benjamin with, And verse 29, if you take this one from me and harm comes to me, you will bring down my gray hairs in sorrow. And so it was, Judah is pleading for his brother Benjamin, but not so much for his brother Benjamin, but for his father's well-being and his mental health. He knows the anguish that Jacob, Israel, the same person, Jacob and Israel renamed. He knows the pain, the sorrow, the depth of emotion of losing Joseph and what that did to his father. And he knows what losing another son would do to his father. And it's, he just can't see that. He says, I fear the suffering that would come upon my father. That's the end of chapter 44. But today we read also chapter 45, and it says, Joseph could no longer control himself. And he sends everyone else away, and he says, I am Joseph. He tells his brothers, I am Joseph, your brother. Is my father still alive? And they didn't know how to answer him. They were dismayed. So Joseph tells them, he says, come closer and look at me. I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. Do not be distressed or angry because you sold me here, but God has set me before you to preserve life. And so Joseph speaks to his brothers, tells them who he is, and he tells his brothers to go and to bring their father. And then Pharaoh finds out, and Pharaoh says to his, Pharaoh and his servants were pleased, and they say, take your wagons from the land and the little ones. Give no thought to your possessions, for the best of all the land in Egypt is yours. And so this story of Joseph and how he became this important and well-respected person in Egypt is the story of how Israel and all of the Hebrews came to be in Egypt. And because now Joseph's brothers return home and tell their father that it's time we go to Egypt, and so that we can have food. And Joseph, your son, is there. Think of the joyous trip that they had back to tell their father that their other brother Joseph was alive. Think of the relief they had at knowing that their brother Joseph, whom they'd sold into slavery, who they didn't have any idea what had happened to him. Think of how they felt upon that reunion and the dismay that they felt at how God had used him. And just to go back to the very beginning of what this was, accountability. And it's such an important thing in life, and it's such an important thing for people to be accountable, to be upright, to be filled with integrity, to be looked upon as reliable. And it's who we need to be. We need to be accountable. And speaking of accountability, each of us will be accountable to God for who we are and what we've done, but above all, for believing in his Son.